Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. For decades, California agriculture has relied on irrigation and unregulated groundwater pumping to make the most of our environment, particularly the lack of natural rainfall, the deficit that we have in that regard. With the advent of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, otherwise known as SGMA, coupled with the effects of climate change, those days are about to come to an abrupt end. What is the future of Valley agriculture in a limited water environment? In short, can Valley agriculture actually survive with much less water? Our guest has recently written a report on that issue. She's Petersen. She's the Associate Director of the non-partisan Public Policy Institute of California Water Policy Center. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be here.
So listen, before we get started, let's set the stage. SGMA, which everybody seems to be talking about, a pretty big issue. Can you tell us a little bit how SGMA is going to likely impact Valley agriculture?
Sure. Yeah. So a bit of SGMA 101. This law was passed back in 2014, and the target is to bring groundwater basins in the state back into balance, meaning we're not pumping out any more than can naturally recharge into our aquifers in any given year by the year 2040. And as you pointed out, groundwater has been unregulated in California for a long time. This was a response to that and to the negative impacts that we were seeing from overpumping of groundwater, things like land.
Yeah, and you guys have talked about, I believe you're talking about the possibility of taking anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million acres of ag land out of production as a result of the full implementation of SGMA by 2040. Mm-hmm. So, but you suggest there are other less drastic options than doing that. Specifically, you say we should take a closer look at what's called water-limited cropping systems or water-limited agriculture. And you're not talking about improving irrigation systems. You're talking about keeping land in production while using very little irrigation water. First of all, what is water limited ag? And second, can you explain the advantages of that?
Sure. Well, so dryland ag is something that's been practiced in the arid and semi-arid areas of the world, including California, for a long time. And it basically just means producing crops using only what falls out of the sky, as opposed to using irrigation to make that possible. And then we use the term water limited agriculture to encompass that, and also crops that are grown with just a little bit of irrigation, the possibility.
And if my numbers are correct, you're the expert, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like a 75% reduction in irrigated water.
Yes. Right. We're talking about using.
I always want people to double check my math.
No, yeah, it's that or more, because we're talking about maybe 8 inches of irrigation as opposed to something like 3 to 4 acre feet. So, and that's,
most people can understand
4 feet of water on 1 acre of land, which might be applied on a fully irrigated crop throughout.
Right. So you're talking just 25% of what you normally use in irrigated land. So that's a pretty big, significant decrease. So can you provide some examples of dryland agriculture outside of California? Some examples?
Sure. Yeah, it's quite widespread across, like I said, arid, semi-arid areas that have similar climates to California, like Australia, Washington State, the inland part of Washington State. They do this on a very large scale, thousands or hundreds of thousands of acres at a time, as opposed to maybe the hundreds of acres that we would do in California. And then you have the Great Plains region of the United States. The regions that rely on the Ogallala Aquifer are dealing with a similar situation of groundwater depletion, and it's prompting a return to dryland forms of production away from irrigated production, because there's simply not water to support irrigated production.
When I was looking at your report, obviously you put a big emphasis on using winter wheat. That was what we used for your modeling. Why winter wheat?
Well, the main reason is that it's something we're very familiar with in California, and it's a very typical dryland crop. So you often see commodity grains and things like that grown in dryland or very water limited contexts. But the other reason is simply because it's a very well-studied crop. We understand it quite well and its physiology, how it works, and it's easy to simulate with our computer models. That's not to say, however, that it's the best dryland crop for all growing conditions or for California. It's just the best starting point for us to sort of understand what might be the scope for this.
Yeah, I don't know if you I don't know if you know this, but Clovis was named after Clovis Cole, who was considered the wheat baron in the late 1800s in the United States. So yeah, I think he farmed 50,000 acres. So that there is a history here with using winter wheat as a crop.
Absolutely, yeah.
One of your we only got about 30 seconds left, but I want to ask you, one of your takeaways in your report was instead of relying strictly on dryland crops with limited applicability to the valley, you were talking about something called dryland plus farming. What exactly is that?
Right. Well, that's a term that we're sort of using interchangeably with water limited agriculture, right? It's a little bit easier to say, but basically, this is growing crops with whatever precipitation falls from the sky, whatever rain you get, plus a little bit of supplemental irrigation just to help get crops started. And the rainfall variability in the San Joaquin Valley is huge, both within one season, across seasons, as we've seen with these swings from drought years to flood years. And that's very challenging for the reliability of a dryland crop, and it's very risky. So
yeah, and the way I understand it is that little extra water can make a huge difference.
Yes.
So up next, we're actually going to talk about that. What are some of the benefits of water limited agriculture? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Caitlin Petersen. She's the Associate Director of the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California's Water Policy Center about what agriculture might look like in the Valley if they have to take 500,000 to 1 million acres and kind of change that in a way that is going to have dramatic water use, at least on that acreage. So typically people often talk about like fallowing land or idling land, and they use those terms interchangeably. But actually you're saying, no, they're actually quite different. So what's the difference between, managed fallowing and unmanaged idling?
Well, that's an important little nuance that you picked up on. In fact, seasonal fallowing as part of a typical rotation between the on season and the off season is a very standard agricultural practice. That's a little different from the kind of fallowing that we're talking about in this report, because that's taking land out of production specifically for the purposes of reducing demand for groundwater for irrigation. A lot of that land is managed in some way to keep down weeds, usually by plowing or disking. That's differentiated from land that is some unmanaged, idle land that is just sitting there and not being really taken care of. That can quickly become a nuisance. And
so some would say that looks like my yard.
Right, the tumbleweed farm, yes. Exactly.
So you were talking about in your report, people are kind of worried about unmanaged idling ag land just can exacerbate some of the valley's already problematic air quality. And you're saying that this water limited crops can actually mitigate that problem. Could make it less of an impact on air quality. How so?
Yeah. So one of the nuisances that I was referring to is this issue that idled land that's not being managed in some way can be a source of dust emissions just from wind kicking across that land and picking up dust. So agricultural operations can also generate dust, I think it's fair to say. So sometimes it's hard to pinpoint what exactly is the net effect of taking land out of production. But with these more managed situations, there are ways to control that and keep down dust. But really the best way to keep down dust is by having plants in the ground and roots holding that soil there. So you can do that with a water limited crop that you're also intending to take to harvest and market. But you can also do it with just some vegetation that's specifically there to take care of dust. And you can do that.
If you go by any ag field that's being dissed, or if you go by a construction site where they're leveling it, and all the dust that and the particulate matter that comes out of it is quite significant. So we're talking about this water limited agriculture and those options being essentially no irrigated water, just using what the rainfall is, versus this dry farming plus or dry plus situation where you're using minimal amount of water, about 75% less than you'd use on an irrigated piece of land. We talked about those few inches really make a difference.
Yeah, and I think if you talk to any grower in the valley that has experimented with this, they would tell you they wouldn't even try for a dryland crop without just a little bit of irrigation to help get the crop started. And it's because of that rainfall variability that I talked about. There's issues with the timing of that rainfall. There's issues with the amount of that rainfall. A lot of our rainfall events in the valley happen very frequently, but it's a very small amount of water that never even really gets down into the ground for plants to be able to use. So I would say those little supplemental irrigation events, they definitely don't guarantee you success, but they really reduce the risk of failure to something that's more manageable.
Yeah, and maybe the answer is a little can mean a lot in this situation. A little water can really make a difference. The other thing you talked about, you read the report, and it talked about forage, basically harvesting wheat before it's fully formed, I guess, and then versus harvesting wheat when it's completely done, as grown or whatever. You're noting that forage might be a better use of available water than waiting till wheat is fully grown. How so?
Yeah, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but things like winter wheat are actually often grown for forage in the San Joaquin Valley. For example, dairies will grow this as what they call a silage crop. So they'll harvest it before the grains are fully formed, and then pack it in such a way that it ferments. And this is really highly nutritious feed for cows. But the way we determine the best use of water is by a sort of index called water productivity. And that's one way of saying crop per drop. So how much green stuff do you get per unit of water that you apply? And there's an economic lens to that. So what is your potential income from a crop grown with X units of water? And there's also kind of an agronomic perspective to that. So actually,
well, let me ask you,
biomass can you get?
I'm sorry, but let me ask you though. So you're basically saying this could be used in place of hay. And so does that work out, in terms of hay prices but instead of hay prices, we do this forage. Is it going to pencil out?
Yeah, so what we found is that it can actually be a pretty high value use of water. And so with this being a water limited system, the grain yields that you would get don't necessarily justify the additional water that it would cost you to take a crop all the way to a fully mature grain. Mm-hmm. Hay prices, like with many ag commodities, they fluctuate a lot, so it's hard to predict these things. But at least in the last couple of years, it's been quite expensive, which is a good thing for growers.
And at least you're getting something for your land as opposed to fallowing, getting nothing.
Exactly. So, you're getting something rather than nothing. So it's not going to compare to the kinds of returns you would get with an almond crop, for example. Right. We're not talking about growing wheat instead of almonds. We're talking about growing.
And so, so then a farmer can decide, do I want to do this? Do I want to do solar? Whatever. What is the best return on investment?
It's one of the series of options that you could potentially have for a given piece of land.
Okay, well, up next, we're gonna talk about some of the ways we can expand opportunities for water limited ag in the Valley. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Caitlin Petersen with the PPIC's Water Policy Center about water limited farming in the San Joaquin Valley, and I want to turn our attention to whether there might be ways to expand our options in this regard. So we've been talking a lot about winter wheat, which is one thing you've studied and modeled. But are there other things that we can do to kind of add to that water limited portfolio?
Sure. Yeah. As I said before, the main reason we looked at wheat is because it's something we're very familiar with in the Valley, but it's far from the only option for these kinds of systems. And growers are very good at figuring out what works for their land and for the way they operate. Within that same category of wheat, things we can grow in the winter are typically cereals, what we would call small grains, things like millet, barley, and oats. There are also some things like triticale, which is a wheat rye hybrid that is specifically very good for producing forage. Basically, these are flexible annual crops that make good use of available water. In some cases can be a pretty high value use of water, and that they work well on large scales. So they can potentially play a big role in taking care of some of this transitioning land, these thousands of acres of transitioning land in the Valley that we're talking about.
The other thing you talked about in your report, you're going to actually go into great detail about the possibility of integrating livestock into water limited systems. How would that work?
Yeah, this is again another way to create the option to earn multiple sources of revenue from the same parcel of land. It's basically another way of managing risk that's quite common in dryland systems elsewhere. So it's available to land managers that are implementing these kinds of systems. One of the ways you could think of doing that is growing a forage crop of some kind, and maybe you want to harvest that for hay, but you could also, maybe if it's not going to be a great year for hay, bring in some sheep and have them graze down that forage before it's harvested. You see this in some dryland areas. It's called dual purpose crops that can serve both as early fodder for grazing livestock and then later grows into a grain that would probably work best in wetter areas. And some land losing water might be too marginal even for the kinds of crops we're talking about. Those
Yeah, but it's integrating the livestock and also just the traditional crop that you're growing to make the land more efficient, which is I guess we're all focusing on. I want to ask you about some of the challenges, considerations, and benefits of converting ag land into rangeland.
Right. Well, particularly on the edges of the valley, a lot of land that is now a perennial crop was formerly rangeland. So could it go back to being rangeland when it's no longer possible to grow trees there? Some of the benefits of that, this is one of the most friendly types of agriculture for wildlife, for pollinators. There's been a lot of work looking at the carbon drawdown potential on rangelands as well. So there's a lot of opportunity. Definite challenges on the economic side. As with anything, a ranch is a business and has to pencil out. There has been some interesting studies by folks in the UC Cooperative Extension System about what it would take to convert a retired orchard back into range. There's a big upfront cost. Of course, you have to remove irrigation lines, install fencing, and you have to figure out the operations. Folks that grow trees usually aren't livestock people, and they don't want to be livestock people. So the business structure has to be worked out, and we might have to get creative about how to make that work.
Yeah, but there aren't just, I mean, you know, in your report, there aren't just economic benefits to doing this. There are other benefits as well. Can you talk about a little bit about some of those?
Well, when it comes to just having crops in the ground, as opposed to not, one of the benefits is just keeping that land operational for agricultural purposes. So you might need to have it in wheat or a water limited crop for only a couple of years, and then it could turn into something else. It just keeps that land flexible, right? But then there are lots of other co-benefits from a biological standpoint, things like what it does for the soil. It keeps the soil loose, it keeps the structure good so that rainfall can really percolate in there, as opposed to a bare piece of land that's just kind of baking in the sun and turning into a brick. It makes it easier to manage weeds because that's kind of already incorporated into what you need to do for the crop instead of an additional cost for managing an otherwise unproductive piece of land. So there are lots of opportunities.
One of the things I saw in your report, it says that dryland winter wheat uses roughly the same amount of water as tilled fallow would lose via evaporation, which is really kind of interesting. People don't realize, evaporation. If you leave it barren, like you said, it just becomes caked and dry, and you just lose it. And maybe some of that.
Right. Yeah. So whatever you might get in terms of rainfall, a lot of that, the majority of that, just evaporates out of the soil. So it's not a very efficient use of that water.
So another good reason
with a crop, especially if it's water stressed and it doesn't just have all of the water. Once it runs out of water in the soil, it stops using water. So it's not just kind of using water forever and ever, which means that in a water limited system,
something
could come out relatively equally. Yeah.
Something to think about, and you have. Well, up next, we're going to see what needs to be done to actually make the system work. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Caitlin Petersen with the PPIC's Water Policy Center about what needs to be done to ensure that water-limited agriculture, farming, is economically viable in the valley. We talked about SGMA earlier, potentially taking anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million acres out of production. I'm just wondering, what are some of the hurdles that are going to have to be overcome to make this work for that land?
Well, one of the biggest ones, as you said, is the economic hurdle and making sure that to the extent possible, these kinds of systems and this land use option can be self-sustaining. That's probably going to mean keeping operating costs low and ensuring that these systems can be implemented on some kind of scale to be able to achieve the favorable economies. We also probably need to understand more about the long-term effects of other factors like soil salinization that could limit the long-term sustainability of these kinds of crops. And we have to find the water. So if there's no water available for supplemental irrigation because of the cutbacks in the area, then it's going to be very difficult to implement this.
We got a lot of work to do. Going forward, I know you focus on research and development. What research you think needs to be done when it comes to dryland farming or dryland plus farming?
Well, we need to dial in our genetic resources. So there's some breeding that needs to be done to develop varieties that are good for forage, that do well under water stress, that type of thing. We also need to dial in management approaches. So we are familiar with winter wheat and other kinds of winter crops in California. But if we could really hone that in to make it work in a water limited context, that would be important. And also understanding that net water balance that we talked about before. So how does that compare in a cropped field relative to what you would see in the default fallow management? I think that'll be important for the local entities that are in charge of divvying up groundwater allocations and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and you were talking in your report about the fact that you need California-specific data. That caught my eyes. Yeah, just because it works in Australia or someplace else doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work here.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So, okay, so let me ask you this. What do you see as the primary policy priorities for successful transition from irrigated ag land to this, productive water-limited agriculture? And what's government's role here?
Right. Well, I think the main role that I see for government here is figuring out policies that help to de-risk that transition, because any transition in cropping system for a grower is a risk. So that could mean financial support in the form of incentives, cost shares, and grants. It could mean supporting technical assistance for implementing these kinds of crops, pilot programs, so that growers and land managers can actually see these things in action and see them working. And at the local level, for groundwater sustainability agencies trying to figure out their programs for how to do planned fallowing and how to manage that land, we just have to avoid making policies that disincentivize winter management practices that could bring some of these benefits.
Yeah, the government does have a role to play, or they can really help farmers, because, like you were saying, the limited amount of water can make a huge difference in getting these crops established. So that's still an issue, but it would be a 75% reduction in the water used on that land. And so, it's really interesting. More and more research needs to be done on that, obviously. We're talking about the possible impacts of SGMA, which is huge, can be fully implemented by 2040. And that's going to balance groundwater, what goes into the groundwater and what's being taken out of the groundwater. By the way, we're one of the last states, we may be the last state to actually regulate groundwater. Texas implemented something before us. So I'm just wondering, we only got about 30 seconds left. Isn't all of this in the final analysis going to be an individual decision by the landowner?
Well, that's the key question, right? And that our ability to coordinate decision-making on land use and try and take advantage of what synergies might exist in planning for land, for water, for energy, and to reduce the cost of that transition. The more that we're able to do that, the less difficult that transition is going to be and the better the outcome will be.
So let's give them lots of options. I want to thank our guest, Caitlin Petersen, with the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California's Water Policy Center. And thank you for joining us. If you want to stay up with current state and local politics, you can sign up for the Maddy Daily by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.com. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.